One of the best things about acrylic paints is how fast they dry, right? And one of the worst things about acrylic paints is how fast they dry. So it's so frustrating when you have just been partway through a painting and you've got a whole pile of paint on your palette, and you know that the next time you go back to it, the paints are all going to be dry and you just have to throw them away. So I've got a trick for you. You can go out and buy quite expensive stay wet palettes, but I'm going to show you today how to make your own stay wet palette that will make your acrylic paint stay wet nearly forever. So this is a set of paints. I always label them because I paint in acrylic and oil, so I need to know which one is which. So I've put this is my own homemade stay wet palette, and I've put this in a fridge overnight, and I've opened it up this morning, and can you see that the paints are still shiny on top? So they're glistening wet. I'm not sure if you can see in the light just there, but they're still really, really wet. So if I touch any of these, you can see lovely wet paint on the top of them. They haven't even built a skin over the top of the paints. So I'll show you how to make your own stay wet palette. It doesn't take much. The essential ingredient is a plastic box like this that you can close. If you don't have one of these, there's some substitutes that you can use as well. So you can probably put this whole thing together for less than, the cheapest you could probably do is like a couple of dollars, or even less, $1, let's say $1. But this setup here is probably about $5. So this is a fantastic way of having a stay wet palette. You can also use this trick for oils if you want to, but acrylics are such deadly ones because they just dry so fast. So let me show you how to go about making your own stay wet palette. Okay, so let me show you what you need to get started with. So the first thing is one of these boxes. Now I love these boxes. I love them for my paints, and they're fantastic for temporary palettes. And I get them from the office supply store or any sort of large stationery chain. You can often get these boxes. They're called document boxes. So this is like letter size or A4, but slightly bigger with a bit of room around the edge. That's a perfect size that you can just put in any old palette. You can just throw your palette in there after you've finished painting, box it up and put it in the fridge, and that will keep the paint for longer than it normally would if you've got it all sealed up and locked away and in a cool fridge. Some people even put it in a freezer. But this way, with a stay wet palette, it will last for ages. In a fridge it might only last a few days. If you're lucky, some colours might last a week for oil. But for this making your own stay wet palette, here's what I do. The first thing I do is a couple of sheets of paper towel, and I've worked out that this length here, if I take 1, 2, 3 squares, fold it in half, pop it in, and you might want a couple of layers of this. 1, 2, 3, fold it in half, put it in. So that might be right. Sometimes I put 3 rounds of that. Then you need a pile of water in there. These are great boxes because they're waterproof. If you can't afford one of these boxes, then what I've used in the past when I was starting out was an old baking tray. So if you've got an oven that had an old baking tray, or you can find it in a second-hand store, a baking tray that nobody loves anymore, and as long as it's waterproof, it doesn't have any holes punched in the outside edges, or a lamington tray. A lamington tray has a bit of depth around the edge of it. That's probably a very Australian thing or a New Zealand thing. So once I put the water in here, just enough to soak up into these towels, this will actually stretch the towels out a bit. So I kind of stretch it out, let it expand out anyway. We're going to keep this wet by putting more water in when we need to, if it ever dries out. but it takes days and days for it to dry out, sometimes weeks. So on top of that, we'll just put a sheet of any old cheap, this is a very cheap disposable paper palette. So I just take a sheet of that one and pop it on top. These disposable palettes have got two sides. There's a sort of a papery side and then the glossy side, which is waterproof. It's got a waterproof side to it. And smooth that out so there's no wrinkles. And then you've got a palette that you can squeeze your paints onto. Here's some nice cobalt blue. Now let's use this pretty one here. One of my favorites, turquoise. Put some nice turquoise out here. I've got a special way of laying out my palettes that's the same every time. You can see that in another Ninja art tip. So once you put the paint on there, this sheet of paper forms a barrier so that the moisture doesn't come up through the paper, but it just kind of permeates. It doesn't wet the paint and soak it, so you don't end up with a big spread of paint, but it's just damp enough, and maybe the moisture around the edges as well keeps the box nice and damp, but it feels cool to touch, but it's dry, this surface. So you need to have a surface there that's going to be waterproof, but allow the moisture to just kind of almost vapor through. So an alternative, if you don't have a disposable paper palette pad, then if you don't have one of those, simple old kitchen baking paper will work just as well. This is what I used to use with my old baking tray when I first started out painting. This is really good because the moisture just kind of permeates, but it doesn't soak up through and then soak into your paint. So just what you need for this surface layer here. So once you've smoothed that out, you can just lay all your paints around there. And if you were to keep this in the fridge for days or weeks, you would still be able to open it up and see that you've got wet acrylic paints. So that's how you build your own Stay Wet palette. There's two more tricks I want to tell you about. The first thing I noticed when I started doing this was my paints would last for weeks and sometimes months. So sometimes what would happen is while the paints and all of this water is sitting in the fridge, you can end up getting this kind of smell that's the beginning of mildew. So little spores get in there, and eventually if you leave it there for months and months on end, then sometimes after weeks or months you get a bit of a sort of a stink coming out of this tub, because you know the water's gone really stale in the fridge, and the moisture sitting in there for so long starts to grow greeblies, and sometimes you can get greeblies growing on the paint. So to avoid that, I've worked out this really simple trick. In my studio I have all these little bottles of deadly liquids. I always label them. This is just pure bleach. In Australia we call it White King, and I've just poured a little bit into an empty medicine bottle with a dropper on it and labeled it. Make sure you label all of these jars that have got toxic stuff in them. Keep them away from kids, hide them away in the upper cupboards, keep them away from pets, but make sure you label each of them with exactly what's in it. It's too easy to mistake this for a little bottle of water. It's clear liquid. So what I do to prevent the stink and the mildew growing is I'll put in 3 drops. This is what I worked out. The premium is 3 drops of bleach into the underside of the paper towels. So you don't want to put it on the top. You don't want any bleach to come through and affect the color of your paint. So this is what I do. I'll show you. I've got the dropper filled with bleach here. So I lift this up and I put 1, 2, 3 drops, rough enough, doesn't have to be exactly 3 drops there. Now just in case there's any drips coming out, I'll just pop it over there. So just having 3 drops of bleach sitting in underneath there, I've found stops any smell from ever happening in my Stay Wet palette. So that's a really important ingredient to add. Actually, I've got a third tip for you as well. So the second tip, first tip is add 3 dots of bleach in underneath everything. The second tip is when you start mixing your colours, let's say I want to mix some of this pretty yellow, this is cadmium yellow, light, and the turquoise, and get a really pretty lime green. My normal mixing knife is this one. I love this little knife. It's a Lafranc-Bourgeois Atrium palette knife, a little small one that's very sharp. Now, this sharpness of this knife for mixing colours is no good to use on here because you don't want to risk tearing the paper. So instead, I switched to a mixing knife that's got very rounded edges. So it doesn't have to be as big as this one. This is slightly bigger than what I'd normally use. But if you've got a mixing knife or a small palette knife that doesn't have these really sharp corners, which are likely to stab into the paper, use one that's got rounded edges on it, and there'll be less risk of you tearing through this surface into the paper underneath. So if we take this just very gently and mix them together, you can see you can get this lovely, see I'm even scraping, smashing, that's my favourite way of mixing. Scrape, 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 smash, 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 and that's beautifully mixed. I always polish my mixing blade as soon as I've used it, then it'll last for ages. And so using a palette knife that's got rounded edges is much safer on this paper. So that's the second tip. The third tip is sometimes you'll find that after you've left this in the fridge overnight or for any length of time, what happens is these corners here will start curling up. And that can be annoying if it starts kicking into your paint over here. So this has worked out to be just the right size where I can just fold these corners in under, just a real nice crisp fold there. Just fold it in underneath the paper towel, and that'll stop any of this paper from curling up and over and touching your paints. So that's the third tip. Just fold a little bit of origami on those corners, and that'll stop the paper from curling up. It sort of locks it in underneath there. So I hope you love that tip. I swear by this method. I absolutely love it. The fact that I can still open up my palette the next day or the next week or the next month and see all the paints nice and shiny and wet and ready to use. I just love that. So hope you enjoy using that, and I'll see you in the next Ninja Art tip. Thanks for watching.